Hi, everyone. I'm Donna Andersen, author of lovefraud.com and host of the True Lovefraud Stories podcast. Today, I'm speaking with my good friend, Dr. Liane Leedom. Dr. Leedom is a psychiatrist, a professor of counseling and psychology at the University of Bridgeport, and an expert on the impact of psychopathy on the family members of affected persons. I have questions for Dr. Leedom specifically related to our story of a man who married a woman while they were both in college in the 1960s. She blatantly cheated on him. A combination of stress from discovering her betrayal and the medicine he was taking for a bad cold caused an aneurysm in his brain to hemorrhage. Then his wife abandoned him. The man stopped thinking about her, literally. 40 years later, he went to a college reunion, and all the memories of his former wife came flooding back, causing flashbacks, intrusive thoughts, and depression. This story brings up all kinds of issues about how betrayal and trauma affect the brain. Here's my conversation with Dr. Leedom. How can emotional trauma contribute to physical injury in the brain?
Well, that is currently being researched. So what I'm going to say is preliminary, and also that readers should be aware that when they read popular psychology books about this topic, that it's been very much oversimplified, and also many of the points that are made are not universally agreed upon by experts, and so they should just take it with a grain of salt, because some concepts tend to become quote unquote facts in the popular way out there in the internet, in the discussion sphere, and these accepted facts really are not proven scientific facts. So also I want to say to your listeners that I'm going to be speaking as a clinician and as a scientist, and trying to give a view that represents what is accepted science, and that doesn't necessarily negate other views, such as a view of a person's subjective experience, and that is also very valid, and may not be comport with the scientific view, and it doesn't matter. So, but as I'm speaking as a clinician, I have to speak as according to the scientific view. So that was kind of a long-winded introduction to the answer. As for those listeners who are interested in more details on this subject, I recommend The Body Keeps Score as a textbook on this subject. I do use that in my class, although, again, many of the concepts in that book are not wholly proven and represent the author's opinion. So with that said, I'll just summarize. So stress produces the release of stress hormones, and these include the hormones of the hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal axis. So you notice I said three words: the hypothalamus, which is part of the brain; the pituitary, which is an endocrine gland that is linked to the brain; and the adrenal gland, which is an endocrine gland that sits on top of the kidneys. And every person has two of them, because every person has two kidneys. So those organs produce their own hormones. The hypothalamus produces corticotropin-releasing hormone, the pituitary produces ACTH, and the adrenal gland produces cortisol and other steroid hormones. These hormones circulate throughout the body, where they have effects on all organs. And so I was specifically asked about the brain. So there are two mechanisms by which these hormones, or actually three mechanisms by which these hormones impact the brain. The first is that all three of these hormones are immunosuppressants. they suppress the immune system and they alter the regulation of the immune system. And there is a dynamic interplay between the nervous system, the endocrine system, and the immune system, such that when under stress, that stress upsets this dynamic interplay and opens up the person to autoimmune dysfunction that can affect the brain. So mechanism number one would be some immune mechanism by which the cells and the substances of the immune system, and there are hundreds of those, can affect how the brain functions. The second method is that these endocrine hormones, especially corticotropin-releasing hormone and to a lesser degree ACTH, they act as neurotransmitters in the brain. So they can directly alter brain function. Then the third way is that the end hormone from the adrenal glands, cortisol, is neurotoxic and has been shown to reduce the density of synapses in parts of the brain, including the parts of the brain that are important for memory. But the good news is, so how has that been shown? And I would say out of all the things that I might talk about today, that is the most scientifically proven statement that I'll make, that there is no doubt that cortisol can be toxic to the brain, and that this toxicity is visible under a number of different conditions. First of all, endocrine conditions where there's no specific emotional problem on the part of the person, but they have excess hormones. We see shrinkage of the brain. And that is visible by various means of imaging the brain, including MRI scans, CAT scan, and other means of imaging the brain. So then another way that we see this is in people with depression. When we image the brains of people with depression, they have alterations in this HPA axis as well. They have shrinking in these parts of the brain that are involved in memory. And then lastly, for people that have had trauma, there can be shrinking in the parts of the brain that are involved in memory. Now, for your listeners and all of us who have survived trauma, hearing this might be a very scary thing, because a person might think, oh my goodness, my brain has shrunk. No wonder I can't think. So the good news for you is that all indications are that the shrinking is completely reversible, that there are a number of steps that people can take to correct the problems that are produced by trauma and stress, and I can go into that as we progress, if you want me to.
Okay, well, that's fabulous information, and thank you so much. So, and I definitely want to talk about steps to reduce these problems as we go through the interview. But first of all, this particular person in our story suffered a hemorrhaging aneurysm in the brain. And so what is an aneurysm, and what is the danger of a bleeding aneurysm in the brain?
Well, so the brain could be thought of as kind of like Jell-O in the little self-serve containers you can buy in the grocery store, such that it's a jelly-like substance. It's in a container, and the container is your skull, and it has a finite size, right? And after infancy, when our skull solidifies, the brain is confined to that space. So if any bleeding happens inside the skull, it's going to smush the brain and potentially damage it, and in the extreme case, people die from that. So what an aneurysm is your brain, by the way, takes 20% of the calories you consume every day, well, probably not in America because we all overconsume calories, but say you were just on a diet where you were at stable and not gaining weight. You weren't overeating. So you were just eating, say, 16 to 1800 calorie diet, and you were exercising to burn those calories. 20% of what you took in would go to service the brain. And let me also say this, for children, it's 50%.
Wow.
So the energy requirements of the brain are enormous. And so the brain, because its energy requirements are enormous, has this really intricate vascular supply of arteries and veins, arteries that feed the brain, veins that drain away the waste products. And as we develop in the womb, sometimes the development of these arteries that, if you put your finger on your wrist, you can feel a pulse. Well, you have arteries in your brain that are pulsing like that. Sometimes the walls of these arteries can be weak. And if they're weak, if the person has high blood pressure for maybe they're under stress, or like this gentleman said he was taking cold medicine, or say if someone took cocaine, which, is not in your story, I'm just giving that as an example, the blood pressure can go up. And when the blood pressure goes up in an artery that is weak, it can rupture. Now, if you're lucky, and it sounds like he was probably lucky in this way, right after it ruptures, it will, because it's in a confined space, it will be like you put pressure on it. Like the tissue around the rupture will put pressure on the rupture so that it'll actually clot, and it will prevent further damage. But both the rupturing of the artery itself and the blood leaking into the brain tissue, that damages the brain. And then the brain being squished because blood went in there, so there's not enough room for the brain, that damages the brain. So aneurysms are an extremely serious condition. And, so sometimes they're diagnosed beforehand. People have headaches and whatnot. They get a brain scan, and the aneurysm is seen. So sometimes they'll go in and flip them off and take care of them before they rupture. But a lot of people are walking around. I don't want to scare anybody, but people walk around with these. And these aneurysms occur not just in the brain, but they can be in the arteries of the pelvis, and in the arteries of the abdomen, and in the legs. So they can be pretty much anywhere in your body.
Wow. So in the story, this man's injury caused a condition called alexithymia. Can you explain what that is?
So alexithymia. So I want to suggest to the listeners that what we do in psychiatry / psychology is we observe people to have a set of characteristics. And when we observe those sets of characteristics repeatedly in a number of people, we then kind of make a list of those characteristics, and then we give those characteristics a name. So that does not mean just because we give something a name. So when I do that, when I give something a name, it makes it seem like it's as valid as, say, a chair or a tree or a bird or something in the real world. The names that we call things in psychiatry and psychology do not have that level of validity. They have a lesser level of validity. So I have to say that before I go talking about alexithymia, because I don't want people to get the false impression that there is really a fixed entity amongst people in the world called this alexithymia. There are a few psychiatric conditions that do appear to have that level of validity, but alexithymia is not one of them. So alexithymia is a term used to describe people who, for a variety of reasons, that's why it's not as valid of a category as some other names we might give, because there's a variety of causes to alexithymia. These people have A, which is lack, lexa, which is word, thymia, emotion. So alexithymia means lack of words for emotions. So the common characteristics of these people is that they may experience a physical sensation. So let me just go back. So how do people that do not have alexithymia, how do they relate to their emotions? I have to say that first before I can describe alexithymia. So usually, we'll try to stick with the positive emotions. When I think of the one I love, my heart feels warm, and maybe I might have butterflies in my stomach, and I feel a positive energy in my body. And so when I feel these physical sensations, I know I have love, and then I have the vision of the one I love in my mind. So that's an example of normal emotional functioning. And all emotions work that way. Let's be positive. We'll talk about love. So a person with alexithymia, they might feel that rush in their heart, those butterflies in their stomach, the energy in their body, and they might say, oh, I have a really bad stomach ache, because they are maybe correctly sensing physical sensations, but they're unable to put together the fact that an emotion and a situation and a physical feeling all go together. They can't make that circle. And they tend to focus only on the physical feeling. So a lot of people who suffer with issues related to the body, like chronic medical problems that doctors can't explain, chronic pain that doctors can't explain, many of those people have alexithymia, that what they're experiencing is actually their emotion. But to them, it feels like pain because they don't have this circuit that says, okay, my body feels this way, and there's a situation, and there's this other individual, and I'm angry. They just know, oh gosh, I have a headache, or I have a stomach ache, or I'm having a heart attack, something like that. How does that sound for an explanation?
It sounds amazing. So is there a treatment for alexithymia?
Well, so let me just say some of the causes. And in his case, it may be that the cause was the aneurysm. So there's two ways that brain damage or brain injury, let's call it injury, because if I say damage, it makes it seem irreversible. Mm-hmm. And we're really learning that even in cases where there is pretty severe damage, that exercising the brain does make it work better. So if we say that the brain's been injured, then the viewers, the listeners can understand that we should never be hopeless, that we should always be hopeful, that when we exercise our brains, they're going to improve and get better. So there's a couple of areas in the brain where physical injury can manifest as alexithymia. One is the corpus callosum, which is the tract of fibers that joins the right and left parts of the brain, because the experience of emotion is a whole brain experience. The right brain is really working on the physical part and the situational part, and the left brain is working on the interpretation part. So if there's damage to that corpus callosum, the physical part and the emotional part will go on independent of the left brain's ability to interpret it. So there are many cases of individuals where it does appear that their alexithymia was related to not good communication between the right brain and the left brain. So that's one class of people. And then also, because the right brain is directly involved in the experience of emotion more than the left brain, damage to the right brain can produce alexithymia. And so those two areas are the main culprits that have been pinpointed, and there are probably other areas of the brain, because the brain is basically a network, kind of like Facebook. And so when we say that one area is important, what we really mean is that, like if you're a person in Facebook that has a lot of people connected to you, if we take you out, all the people in your network are going to be less connected because we took you out. So the corpus callosum and the right brain are examples of that. They're hubs for emotion. And if we remove them and they don't function as well, then our emotional experience is going to be altered.
So is there any treatment, or you mentioned exercise?
I would say that that would have to be individualized. And I think it starts with awareness. And this is why I love The Body Keeps Score as a book, because he really goes to this, that it's awareness of the body, awareness of our physical sensations that is the beginning of emotional awareness. And so one of the things that happens when people have trauma is that connection to the body gets altered. And so if, as a way of healing and getting back our full emotional experience, reconnecting with the body is an important component.
Wow. Okay. So in this case, our man in the story believes that he suffered from repressed memories. So how does the brain go about repressing memories?
Okay, so I researched this thoroughly for you before this interview. So what I want to say, again, this is the main area where there are many, many, many clinical experts who do not believe in the phenomenon of quote-unquote repressed memories. And then there are also many, many experts who believe that repressed memories are very important. And the field generally considers repressed memories to be different in adults than in children. So the study of repressed memories of child abuse of all kinds kind of are set apart from the study of repressed memories in an adult. So since your particular situation involves an adult, let's just focus on adults. So what the research shows somewhat is that repressed memories are kind of a spectrum, at least, in that it's not a zero. Like so many things in psychology are a spectrum, and it's not like a 0 or a 1, like a binary choice, a category. So repressed memories vary along a continuum. And when they studied people with repressed memories and really looked at the history of this, they find that, maybe when the person was several years after the event, they did share the event with someone. So it's not as if the memory was completely repressed. Sometimes people forget that they remembered. So if that makes any sense. Mm-hmm. And so it really isn't, because this whole idea of, is a memory ever fully repressed? Because it's so controversial, I can't really present to you a mechanism. And also let me say that one of the reasons why this is controversial is that for a lot of people who have trauma, they can't forget it and they wish they could, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. So it's almost as if there is a spectrum of responses that, hey, maybe part of it for some people is, I'm just not going to think about that. And then over time, it fades. And there is laboratory evidence that if you tell someone, don't remember this, and tell them to force themselves not to remember something, they do actually forget it. There's some psychological experiments showing that that's the case, that you can make yourself forget something. So if I were going to venture a speculation, it would be along those lines rather than the Freudian unconscious, brain doing some crazy thing. And this is what I mean by a lot of these concepts in psychology have entered the popular sort of sphere, the internet sphere, the cyber sphere, and people then believe in them, but there really isn't a lot of evidence for them. So I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I'm not saying it does exist. I'm just trying to present to the listeners a balanced view. And certainly for this man, he has physical reasons why his memories would have been affected. So, and it also doesn't surprise me what we know. And so I'm just guessing, but I know how old I am and when I was born. So I'm guessing a person who was in college in the 60s is probably close to 80 now, right? 70, 80. And
right.
So often as people get older, their memories of those years, their young adulthood and their teenage years, get more and more vivid. And especially in the context of a triggering event, like his reunion, that would have triggered the remembrances that he has it. And this is not very much out of the ordinary. I have treated many people with Alzheimer's, dementia, and other forms of dementia. And in interviewing their family members, I'll say, how is your mom or dad's memory? And they'll say, oh, their memory is perfect. They remember everything from 40 years ago, right? So this is a characteristic of people of that age, not just people with dementia, but people as they get older, their memories of long ago become increasingly vivid, and we don't know why that is. And so if as people are getting older, their memories and their suffering related to interpersonal victimization, that could become stronger, and people shouldn't blame themselves or think that they're weak. That is a natural part of human development, that some of these things that happen during early adulthood become more painful to people as they get older.
Is there the possibility that the brain was, or maybe him psychologically was protecting himself by not remembering these things, or putting it out of his mind?
So this is where I say, for him, if that's what he feels and that's what he believes and that's helpful to him, that's important. So that the answering that question for him, I would say yes. If he says that this is true, then I would believe it. But then if that is a different question than saying, if you take a group of people that have forgotten something, is it because the brain is protecting itself? You can't prove that. Think about how would you do an experiment to prove that one way or the other. So that question cannot be addressed scientifically.
Okay. And so then
So clinicians should only speak on things that they can really verify scientifically. And if we're going to say from a spiritual perspective, we can speak from a spiritual perspective any way that we want. And that spiritual perspective, in my view, is equally valid to the scientific perspective. But if people are going to be looking to me to represent science, I want to try to do that to the best of my ability. But then if you want to ask me about spirituality, I could talk about that too. That's just a different way of conceiving of reality.
Okay. So, how about the triggering event then? In this particular case, he, went back, had the reunion, more than 40 years later, and then it all comes flooding back. So can you comment on why that may have happened?
Well, I think that all of your listeners have experienced this, right? That on a lesser level, they say, you're walking through the woods and you hear a bird. And a long time ago, your grandfather told you the name of that bird, and it starts with a V, but you can't think of it. And so you go and you just look at the list of bird names that starts with a V, and you go, oh, yeah, it's a veery. So we use cues to recall memory. That's how memory is structured in the brain. Events are linked to other events, and the recall of other events, they're all related to each other. So if we put a person back into a situation they were in before, it will fully trigger any memories they have about being in that place. That's everybody has that.
Okay, so then in this case, it led to depression, and it was really debilitating for this man. So is it kind of like an opportunity for treatment at this stage of life?
Yeah, so now I'd like permission to talk from a spiritual perspective.
Okay.
And I'll try in this case, and I'm not going into him, but I'm going to speak generally about how a spiritual perspective can be integrated with cognitive behavioral psychology. So when we speak of, oh boy, this is kind of okay, I'm going to give the answer first, and then maybe we can work backward. So from both the spiritual perspective and the cognitive behavioral perspective, my view of reality is fully a fabrication and a construction of my mind.
Okay.
So if I look outside and I say, everything is glorious, okay, that is completely a fabrication of my mind. My mind has taken in all the aspects of what's out there and has put them together and come up with this construction of the world as glorious. Spiritual people say that, and cognitive behavioral people say that. So it is not surprising that a person who recalls something that was very painful would then have their typical construction of their reality shaken to the core and replaced by a construction of reality that is very that is the cause of suffering. The Buddhists call that dukkha. Psychologists call it false beliefs, or a different worldview, or automatic thoughts. It's the same thing. This is about the view of reality that our mind constructs. So go ahead, ask me a question about that.
Oh, okay. Well, then, so how was it was traumatic for this man. So was it an opportunity for healing?
Right. So I think from both the spiritual perspective, which kind of comes from Eastern philosophy more than others, the spiritual perspective would say, yes, that this is a time whenever we have dukkha, which is emotional suffering, it's an opportunity for us to look inward mindfully and really probe the source of the dukkha. What is causing my emotional suffering? And dissect it to a very fine level to understand all the details of how this caused the emotional suffering. And so a mindfulness practitioner, a meditator, would do that, and also a cognitive behavioral therapist would also dissect this whole range of negative emotions that is part of the trauma experience. And it's a bunch of emotions that the person has, and each one has to be dissected, analyzed, and understood as part of the person's recovery. And that is irrespective of whether or not they also use medication to help. Studies show that the combination of medication and this kind of either mindfulness-based practices or cognitive behavioral practices, or medication plus cognitive behavioral plus mindfulness, that works even better. So any combination of those can help a person gain a perspective that then can transform them. They can come out of the trauma more mindful, more alive, more awake, more aware than they ever were before the trauma.
Well, we brought this up a little bit earlier. What are some of the things, the exercises that can be done to help the brain recover?
Okay, so let's just speak, if I could just speak generally about trauma, and then, and not say specifically about him, because obviously if someone has damage to different parts of the brain, they would have to do exercises specifically to repair those particular parts of the brain that the psychologist or neurologist determines are damaged. So that's a different issue. So if we just talk about psychological issues, trauma, depression, anxiety. So the first step is a mindfulness practice. Now, that mindfulness practice has usually two forms. The first form is formal mindfulness practice, and that's where the person sets aside a few minutes every day to look within and to be open to whatever is being experienced. So this, for some people, they have to get there gradually, because if a person who has had trauma, if I tell them, oh, go sit there and be open to whatever you experience, that's like a mean thing for me to do to them, because they're like going to be blown out of the water. So they get there gradually by another set of practices that I'll talk in a second. But just say a person isn't so traumatized that they can't sit for 5 minutes to be open to whatever arises. So the issue is to sit. Mindfulness means non-judgmental awareness of the present moment. And so that means that if in my present moment what arises is pain and regret and sadness over what was done to me, then I receive that non-judgmentally, and I accept that that is what is arising. And I learn to observe it. And as I observe it on several different levels. The most important level is I observe where that pain is in my physical body. And for different people, it manifests in different places of the body. So a person sits quietly, maybe focusing on their breath, their breathing, and waits to see, where does this emotion arise in my body? And over time, as they allow that, they can allow it for longer and longer periods of time, and they can become increasingly aware of what's going on inside themselves. And as they become aware, the path forward usually manifests. I have a strong belief in the wisdom of the individual person. And every person has a wisdom within them that if they would just allow it to come forth, they will find the answers. So part of what gets in people's way is how difficult it is to sit with pain. So that gets me to the other set of practices if a person isn't ready for formal mindfulness practice. The other set of practices is mindfully doing things in the daily life. One of my favorite sayings that I like now to say to my students is movement masks dukkha. So dukkha is psychological suffering. And I use the Buddhist word for that because there's really no equivalent in English. It refers to psychological suffering from negative emotions, anger, greed, worry, anxiety, sadness, that whole host of negative emotions. But it also refers to negative emotions that arise when people feel deprived of something that they think they should have or that they really do deserve. So dukkha is pain from deprivation of love, of deprivation of the physical things you need to survive, deprivation of emotions of all sorts, and also pain and suffering associated with all those negative emotions. So movement masks dukkha. So I think for people starting out, the most beneficial thing to do is to walk fast or do some sort of exercise. And it could even be housework, sweeping the floor, washing the dishes. But I think the more you move, like for me, it really was fast-paced walking. For me, it was fast-paced walking. Other people walk slower. Because when you're moving, it's enough of a distraction from that suffering that you can allow it. So people can start to allow the suffering while they're moving around and to be slightly aware of it. So whereas if I'm sitting still, right, it comes at me from full force. If I'm moving around or engaging in other activities, I can allow it in small bits and pieces. As people allow it in small bits and pieces, they can slowly transition over time. And it may take months to transition over time to being able to sit with their, emotions. Now, in addition to these mindfulness practices, there are a host of skills that are best packaged by dialectical behavioral therapy. And these skills teach people how to deal with distress, how to deal with negative emotions, and how to increase positive emotions in their lives. So I would say that it would, for listeners to consider exploring both avenues, both a serious mindfulness practice, but also other skill sets that help give techniques for managing distress and managing negative emotions and increasing positive emotions. And DBT is becoming pervasive in our society, and I'm hoping that I'm going to do my small part to help that happen, because I think that this can transform our society. There are many school systems that are teaching these skills to children and to adolescents especially, to help them manage the trauma they've had, help them manage their emotions, and also start introducing them to the idea of mindfulness. Because the more mindfulness we have, the less suffering we have. And that's pretty, that's experimentally shown to be true. So what the Buddhists have known for 2,600 years or whatever, psychology is just now sort of showing experimentally that, yes, this is the case. These things are all true.
Well, I think that's terrific. And from my experience, one of the benefits of sitting with the emotions or the trauma or whatever it is and enduring that pain is that as you do that, it dissipates. It finally dissolves and goes away so that you can move forward. Is that what you've seen?
Absolutely. And so the Buddhists, listen to this, Donna, for 2,600 years, they've had the saying, that which arises also falls away. And if the listeners could maybe take one thing away from today, or a couple of things, it would be that even when you're in the throes of PTSD, the sense of the traumatic memory is not permanently present at the same level. It arises and it falls away. It arises and it falls away. And as people begin to observe, they notice, obviously, there are triggers for the arising. Well, there can also be triggers for the falling away. And so as people learn that it's not permanent, that it does ebb and flow, and there are triggers, they can start getting used to it. And then the more they get used to it, the less power it has over them, and eventually they habituate to it completely. And then the trauma is starting to resolve itself.
That's fabulous. So I think this has been wonderful. I thank you for your wisdom and your dedication. I know all the work that you've done in this field. So if people wanted to learn more about your work or to contact you, how would they do that?
Well, they can email me at lleedom@bridgeport.edu. And if they want to find out more about my work, they can look at my ResearchGate profile. Some of the articles I've written are up there, and I intend to populate that a little more in the next few months. So I would say those two places are a good start, and I'm happy to answer people's questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Leedom, for this. I appreciate all your work.
Thank you for having me, Donna. And I also want to say that you have been a blessing to me in my life. I believe we've known each other for almost 20 years. So you have always been a blessing to me, and your dedication to survivors, in my view, is unparalleled. So I thank you for doing these podcasts. I think they're going to be a great service to people.
Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I'm Donna Andersen, and this is True Lovefraud Stories. I hope you enjoyed this interview with Dr. Liane Leedom. To learn more about Dr. Leedom's work, visit her page on ResearchGate. Or if you have specific questions, send her an email. For links, please visit the page about this interview on podcasts.lovefraud.com. True Lovefraud Stories is produced by lovefraud.com. I'm the author of lovefraud.com. Engineering is by Terry Kelly. To learn how to recognize and recover from everyday sociopaths, visit lovefraud.com. And for more information about this story, other great stories, or if you'd like to share your story, visit podcasts.lovefraud.com.